So again, so welcome everybody to our last panel of the day, which is titled Teaching the Middle Ages, Strategies and Approaches. We have a very interesting and exciting panel. Also, it's going to be a little bit longer because we have more panelists, but that's all fine. Again, some basic housekeeping rules. Each one of our panelists is going to have 20 minutes to present their papers. And after that, we will have roughly half an hour for Q&A. As you can see, the audience, you cannot unmute yourselves. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat or to raise your hands, and I will allow you to ask your question directly. Our chair for our last session is Andrew Elliott, who I'm very happy to welcome. He's a recurrent presence in our conference, in the very first one, and it's always great to see him. So Andrew is an independent researcher and visiting fellow at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. He specializing in medievalism in popular culture and has published on film, TV, games, social media, and popular cultural depictions of history from classical Rome to the modern day. So Andrew, you can take it from there. Again, it's great to have you back, and it's all your panel.
Thanks very much, Juan. Well, it's always nice to be back. I'm really looking forward to this panel. It's a really exciting and interesting series of topics. So as Juan says, we're going to try and keep to 20 minutes. If you get anywhere sort of towards that 20-minute barrier, I will start sending up reactions on your screen and then interrupt if it goes on too long. So we leave time for discussions. So first paper, we've got Dr. Shivender Rahul, who is currently serving as Assistant Professor of English at Maharashtra National Law University in Nagpur in India. He was previously employed with organizations like the British Council in Delhi and Amity University, Noida in India. He possesses international teaching experience while serving with overseas campus of Amity University at Tashkent. Dr. Rahul has attended various international and national conferences and has authored multiple research papers in journals of high repute. His primary areas of interest include English language teaching. I've just changed my screen. That was very sensible. Translation studies and Urdu poetry. And so are you ready with your presentation there, Shivender?
Am I audible?
You are, yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for the generous introduction. I'll share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Usually takes just a second. It's starting, so we hold on. This looks good. Yeah, we can see the whole of the PowerPoint. So I don't know if you want to move to the show itself.
Yeah. Slideshow, yeah.
Yeah. This looks good. Over to you.
Yeah. All right. So good evening from India. I am Dr. Shivender Rahul. My introduction has already been given. So I'll be starting with my presentation, and the title of my paper presentation is Diversity in the Teaching of the Middle Ages, Exploring the Complexity of Gender and Race. So before I actually begin, I just want to give you a Middle Ages at a glance. I'll just tell you what Middle Age is all about. So between 1000 and 1347 AD, the population of Europe increased from 35 to 80 million, owing to improved agricultural techniques and a milder climate. 90% of the Europe's population was still rural peasants living in small communities of manors or villages. In response to disorder and raids, towns grew up around castles and were frequently fortified by the walls. Peasants spent their days working on the land. Life was difficult with a restricted diet and little comfort. Women were subordinate to men in both the peasant and noble classes and were expected to keep the household running smoothly. Children had a 50% chance of survival after the age of 1 and began to contribute to family life around the age of 12. So this is all about, just to set the tone of the conference. I've just given you what Middle Ages were all about. Now I start with my topic that I want to talk about. Here, if you see, I'll be giving you Middle Ages, the introduction. The teaching of the Middle Ages has traditionally been dominated by a narrow and skewed perspective, shaped by white male scholars. So you can see the white supremacy is dominating here as well. This approach has resulted in a limited understanding of the complexity of gender and race in the period. The Middle Ages were characterized by a complex interplay of power dynamics, including those based on race, gender, class, religion, and nationality. So let's talk about some of the major challenges during the Middle Ages. So marginalized groups such as women, persons of color, and religious minorities, they faced significant challenges, including limited access to education, restricted legal rights, and discriminatory social norms. Women, particularly in the Middle Ages, they face significant challenges such as limited access to education, restricted legal rights, and of course, they were discriminated as well, that I will be discussing in my further slides as well. However, there is always a light at the end of the tunnel. Despite these challenges, individuals and communities found ways to resist oppression, often through creative norms of expression such as literature, music, and art. So let's talk about medieval women. Medieval women and the Middle Ages, that's the name of this particular slide. Women in the Middle Ages used poetry and other forms of writing to challenge traditional gender roles and assert their agency. Of course, being a poet, I also find that poetry is one of the best forms of expression. So the writings of medieval women such as Christine de Pizan and Julian of Norwich, they provide valuable insights into the experiences of women during this period. The medieval poet Marie de France used her writing to challenge gender norms and assert her agency, while Hildegard von Bingen, a medieval nun, was a renowned composer and a healer. So these were the contributions made by the women despite all atrocities, despite all odds. They could express themselves using poetry and other forms of art. Let's talk about the persons of color. They are also known, abbreviated as POC. So persons of color or non-whites in the Middle Ages also faced significant challenges. For instance, Africans were often subjected to slavery and other forms of exploitation. However, individuals and communities resisted oppression through cultural exchange and intellectual contributions. So they exchanged a lot of cultural activities, and as there were some intellectual contributions by them as well. For example, if I talk about the scholars from Al-Andalus region of Arab, they made a significant contribution to the fields such as mathematics, medicine, and literature, despite facing discrimination from European scholars. So you can have a look on the image that I've shared. This talks about how they talked about literature, mathematics, medicine, and other genres of art, especially at that particular medieval ages. Let's talk about the plight of the religious minorities, a kind of medieval anti-Semitism that I'm going to discuss in this particular slide. So religious minorities such as Jews and Muslims faced discrimination based on their religion as well as their race. They were discriminated like anything. For example, during the Crusades, everybody knows about the Crusades. So during that Crusades, Jews were often targeted by Christian crusaders who saw them as enemies of Christianity, and so much so that sometimes Christians used to spit on their face whenever they used to see them. And as we have learned about it as well, that they used to live in the outside part of the city that were known as ghettos. And they used to wear red caps to mark that they are Jews. However, Jews and Muslims found ways to resist such oppression through intellectual and the cultural contributions. As I always talked about, a person would like to see, we always see the light at the end of the tunnel. So they also they have shown the resilience, and they, for example, if I talk about Jewish scholars such as Moses, Maimonides, and Judah, they made significant contribution to the Jewish philosophy and theology. And while Islamic scholars such as Ibn Rushd, he made significant contribution to the fields such as medicine and philosophy. Despite all discrimination, odds, adversities, they asserted their intellect. Let's talk about the double discrimination, especially I'm referring to the women of this particular era. The experiences of marginalized groups in the Middle Ages were shaped by the interconnectedness of different forms of oppression. For example, women of color faced a double burden of sexism and racism. So, of course, being of a dark complexion race, they face the discrimination. Of course, the double discrimination that I'm referring here. Being a woman, she had to face that discrimination as well. One example of women who face such challenges is Queen Zinga of Angola, who led her people in resistance against Portuguese colonialism, while also faces sexism with her own society. So this kind of double discrimination, especially women used to face. So moving ahead, let's talk about Eurocentrism in the teaching of the Middle Ages. So as I was talking about, as my paper also talks about, Eurocentrism has always been dominant in the teaching of the Middle Ages. And if you see, Eurocentrism in the teaching of the Middle Ages reflects and often can be source of bias. So if we keep the Eurocentrism in the locus of the teaching of the Middle Ages, of course, the results that we will be getting that will be skewed and biased. It tends to focus on the history, culture, and achievements of the Europeans and their links to the development of the global cultures and civilization. And as you can see, I personally believe that paved the path to the concept which is known as white man's burden, where they thought that it is their duty to civilize the entire world, especially to the oriental part of the globe. So that's Eurocentrism is all about. And what happens actually here is that it can overshadow the contributions of other civilizations and cultures around the world. So this was about Eurocentrism. And moving ahead, let us understand the importance of diversity in the teaching of the Middle Ages, which my topic also talks about. What is the role of diversity in teaching of the Middle Ages? First of all, it opens up the classroom to new perspectives, unparalleled insight and knowledge of the world. So if we are teaching only through keeping the Eurocentrism in the locus, then they will not have the holistic knowledge of the entire world, and they will not come to know about the culture of the other part of the world. So instead of focusing solely on European perspectives, diversity in the teaching of the Middle Ages should consider the East-West relations, history and interaction between the worlds of Muslims, Christians, Jews, and other communities, of course. This brings a multi-faith. What is the benefit out of that? So it brings a multi-faith, multicultural perspective to the subject that broadens the understanding across the entire world. So it will deepen the horizon. It will give you a broad understanding of the cultures across the world. Let us understand the method. Let us focus on the methods for achieving the diversity in the teaching of the Middle Ages. What methods can be employed, like professors, those who are teaching, especially like us, those who are teaching this. So by using intersectional approach that considers the multiple forms of oppression that individuals and communities faced, we can be genuine while teaching that. By highlighting the interconnectedness of different forms of oppression, we can also talk about that. We can highlight the interconnectedness of the different forms of oppression. We can achieve diversity in teaching by engaging students in collaborative learning, debate, and critical analysis. So collaborative learning, debate, and critical analysis. And I strongly believe in 3Ds: debate, deliberation, and discourse. This includes incorporating guest speakers, interactive videos, and documentary films to represent diverse views, as well as reviewing primary source examples from different world regions. Furthermore, using text from beyond renowned work of European scholars to further explore history from a multicultural, multi-faith experience will foster deeper understanding of the Middle Ages and complex social dynamics that shape this period. So we'll have to be open-minded, we'll have to be broad-minded while we are dealing with such sensitive issues, and it will make them more sensitive, especially the new generation whom we are teaching as of now. Let us move ahead and discuss what will be the outcomes of teaching of the Middle Ages. So if we are teaching, what benefits we will be getting out of it. So by teaching about the Middle Ages using the diverse and interdisciplinary approach, we can offer students a unique and inclusive learning experience. We can broaden their knowledge and appreciation for the different cultures and viewpoints of the past and present. So once they are exposed to the different cultures, they will also be out of this Eurocentrism, and they will also understand the contributions of the Middle Ages made by different races and different communities across the globe. So ultimately, it will build a better understanding of the current issues and event and people from around the world. So let us conclude my presentation. I hope I'm still within the time limit. The teaching of the Middle Ages has shaped, let me summarize what we have discussed so far. So teaching of the Middle Ages was shaped by various factors, including social norms, religious beliefs, and cultural traditions. The exploration of gender and race reveals a diverse and often contradictory landscape where dominant narratives intersected with the subversive ones. So yeah, of course, what we have discussed about the Eurocentrism. The Middle Ages saw the emergence of female voices and perspectives that challenged and subverted patriarchal structures. So despite all odd circumstances, I've given you a couple of examples where these women have averted and they have rather subverted all the patriarchal structures that they were facing. Similarly, it witnessed the coexistence of different racial and ethnic groups, sometimes in conflict and sometimes in cooperation. So it was a kind of mixed match, sometimes conflict and sometimes in cooperation as well. So essentially, we can say that diversity in the teaching of Middle Ages challenges us to reconsider our assumption about them. And through them, we can understand the various kinds of historical things. So these are the image sources that I have used, and I'm open to any kind of questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shivender. That was absolutely perfect timekeeping as well. My compliments for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So you've stopped sharing. Okay, absolutely perfect. Next speaker will be Petra. Do you have a PowerPoint to share there, Petra?
Yes, I do. I will share it right now.
I'll let you get that started. And I think, yes, if memory serves, Petra, you had the misfortune to be chaired by me last year as well, when I think you were a master's student. But
yes, you did, but I had a different surname, so thank you for remembering me.
Well, Petra Plantosar is a doctoral student at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Zagreb. She received a bachelor's and master's degree in history from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University Josip Juraj Strossmayer, Osijek. Plantosar currently works as a teaching assistant at the Department of Church History and Petrology of the Department of Philosophy and History of the Catholic Faculty of Theology in Jakovo, and is external teaching assistant at the Department of History of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in University Josip Osijek. Her current field placement is High and Late Medieval History, focusing on medieval topography and church history in the region of Lower Drava and the Sava rivers. There's a link with the entire list of papers, which I can put into the chat for you if you want to search for any more. And today, Petra is going to talk to us about the Middle Ages and artificial intelligence and the possibilities of use in the teaching of history. So a very timely paper, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Is my screen visible?
It is, but you're on the PowerPoint rather than the show. Do you want to start the show? Would that be?
I started it, so
we can see the kind of the PowerPoint with all of the slides down the side rather than the PowerPoint show.
Okay, I will try again.
We can try again. So again, we can see.
Is it better now? I started it.
I can't see it actually. I can only see the main screen, but if you want, obviously you could just click down the side to change the slides that way.
Is it better now? No,
it
nothing.
Still looks the same unless others can see something and I can't, but it looks to me like it's the main PowerPoint, but I don't think necessarily I can see this yet. 17 slides, so it's up to you if you want. Oh, we're trying again.
I will try again.
Sure.
Still nothing.
Still nothing. I can see that you're I can see that you're clicking on the slideshow. I said we can see the slides. but just
Okay.
not the.
If I may suggest something.
Yes, of course.
Yes, so I cannot read that language which is reflecting on the toolbar. However, there will be an option of slideshow, or either you can press F5 and
Well,
you will get
I started it, but it just didn't show to you.
I'm unable to understand this language. However, there will be an option of making it slideshow from.
I wonder,
I think
sometimes when one has two screens, it can be projecting the wrong screen, but
I will start presentation again because I started the slideshow.
Yeah. So if you start the presentation and then share the presentation. I love how collaborative this is on the chat as well. We've got a participatory helpline going on here.
And I tried it before, so. Still nothing.
It's still the full screen, yeah. Should we try that one? And
yeah,
then...
well, why don't we leave
Okay,
it
I will just start. Can you just see how the slides are changed?
Yeah, so if you were then to click the next slide, we would be able to see the next slide, yeah.
Okay, can I start now?
Sure, please do, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Petra.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the inconveniences. So I greet you all from Croatia and thank the organizers for accepting my topic. So as my title says, the text is mainly oriented toward the possibilities of using artificial intelligence in the teaching of the Middle Ages. In my presentation, I will provide a short introduction and history of artificial intelligence, after which I will present the main idea and hypotheses and examples and advantages and disadvantages of using artificial intelligence in the teaching of the Middle Ages. In recent decades, and especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, the application and development of artificial intelligence have become a constant in everyday human life. The definition of artificial intelligence is the ability of a device to imitate human activities. This mainly refers to reasoning, learning, planning, and applying and developing creativity. The usage of artificial intelligence as a working tool can currently be observed in almost all scientific disciplines. Therefore, rather than thinking about whether artificial intelligence will enter history teaching or whether it should be used, we should focus on the opportunities, strengths, obstacles, and challenges of its application. The use of digital tools in teaching has been known for a long time, but the question is whether history teaching is ready for the introduction and use of artificial intelligence. Although the application of artificial intelligence in historical and medieval research is noticeable, what remains to be explored are the challenges of its application in the teaching of the Middle Ages itself. Although the ideas about artificial intelligence have appeared in literature and even myths since ancient times, its development began with the advent of digital computers in the second half of the 20th century. The term artificial intelligence was coined at the conference at Dartmouth College in 1956, which brought out together the pioneers of the field and encouraged systematic research. That congress was organized by John McCarthy, who later became the author of the basic artificial intelligence programming language, and today he is considered the founder of artificial intelligence. After the initial optimistic forecasts in the 1960s, all the complexity of achieving artificial intelligence that would be measurable with a human came to light, and the research was directed towards partially solutions to certain problems. In 1982, the first paper about using artificial intelligence in history teaching had been published. So the main idea of my paper is that the use of artificial intelligence in everyday life, as well as in learning and teaching the Middle Ages, cannot be avoided, but it is also necessary to learn how to use artificial intelligence in bringing the Middle Ages closer to the Middle Ages for students and the public in formal and informal education. The first hypothesis is that the use of artificial intelligence in the teaching of the Middle Ages can contribute to a better understanding of historical circumstances of this period. The second one refers to that the use of artificial intelligence in the study of Middle Ages will allow more students to read historical sources. And the final is that the introduction of artificial intelligence in the teaching of the Middle Ages as well as its incorporation in museums and archives, will enable faster and better research of historical sources. One of the examples of using artificial intelligence in the teaching of Middle Ages is a running project called Scribe ID AI project. It is an active machine learning for the automatic identification of handwriting in 12th century manuscripts. As a database, digitized manuscripts of Klostenburg Monastery's library service. As a method of this project sets from this corpus, a data set of about 3,150 text pages annotated with scribe assignments is created. Based on this ground truth, a classification model for the identification of scribe is developed and trained. Classical descriptors are supplemented or replaced by automatically learned descriptors. In addition, there is a corpus about 40,000 digital manuscript pages with as yet unknown writer identification. This data source is transformed into data sets and subjected to an active learning approach. The classifier, trained on ground truth, can now make a preliminary writer identification and present any possible hits to paleography-trained experts through an interface. Based on expert evaluation, the model is improved iteratively. et.al is the first deep neural network for the textual restoration and geographical and chronological attribution of ancient Greek inscriptions. et.al is designed to assist and expand the historian's workflow. Its architecture focuses on collaboration, decision support, and interpretability. The picture shows the restoration of a damaged inscription recording a decree from 485 BC concerning the Acropolis of Athens. et.al alone achieves 62% accuracy when restoring damaged texts, and it contributes to historians and archaeologists as well as other researchers to better understand ancient texts. Although this AI algorithm is mainly focused on Greek history, developing such or a similar program for medieval text will surely contribute to some new findings, especially in the examples where one text is erased on the parchment and another one is written over it. In such cases, artificial intelligence programs for reading sources would allow reading all layers of a single source. As the last example, I communicated with ChatGPT. I believe that I do not need to describe ChatGPT in particular, and that the most of you are familiar with some current problems of both the scientific community and the public in the application of ChatGPT. Therefore, I decided to check whether the answers to the question about the Middle Ages that it offers are accurate and comprehensive and finally applicable in the teaching of the Middle Ages. First, I asked him a few general things about the Middle Ages in English, like how he defined the Middle Ages and why, and the answers were satisfactory. As I come from Croatian University and deal primarily with the Croatian Middle Ages, I asked him what he knew about Croatia and the Middle Ages in English. The answer was quite general, something that can be found on the pages of other internet services that offer historical data, but not necessarily of a scientific nature. To get an insight into how he offers answers in Croatian language, I asked him a few questions in Croatian, of which I would like to single out the problems and unsolved questions in Croatian medieval studies. After a general answer that there is a lack of sources, he said that the medieval sources related to Croatia were written in all Croatian language, which is not true and applicable to the Croatian Middle Ages because most of the sources were written in Latin. After that, I decided to ask him some specific and not so general questions. I will show two here. First, I asked him what the Ilok statute was. It is essentially the medieval code of one of the largest medieval cities on the territory of today's continental Croatia, and ChatGPT provided a comprehensive answer, but with several errors. For example, the statute was created in 1525, but ChatGPT says that the year of its creation is 1483. Also, the statute was rarely applied because a year later that part of Croatia was in Ottoman hands and under Ottoman laws, and ChatGPT says that it was applied in Croatia until 1848, which is a significant inaccuracy. The last question I will present is a question related to Lazarus Secretarius. So he was a Hungarian cartographer who lived at the turn of 15th and 16th centuries, and it is best known for having created a map of Hungary before the arrival of Ottomans, known as Tabula Hungariae. ChatGPT to the question who was Lazarus Secretarius offers the answer that he was a Croatian poet and humanist born in Trogir in 1420 and died in Venice in 1489. That he is known for his translation of Greek and Latin authors into the Croatian language, that he was the co-author of the Ilok Statute. Anyway, the full answer to the question who was Lazarus Secretarius is completely incorrect and inapplicable in any respect. Therefore, to summarize, ChatGPT can offer different answers about the Middle Ages, especially some general things. However, when it comes to specific events, people, or documents, it generates answers based on the previous ones, which can ultimately result in completely inapplicable facts. This brings with the question of impossibility of using ChatGPT in the study of the Middle Ages, especially if it is the only source. Digital tools are already widely used in history teaching, although some programs from the opus of artificial intelligence that need to be developed, which would enable a faster and more precise analysis of historical data from sources, would contribute to a more significant use of historical sources in teaching, not only at the faculties, but also in schools. This, in turn, will certainly contribute to a broader picture of the understanding of medieval events, and by interpreting them, students will develop critical thinking. Except for data analysis, it is still demanding to convey to students how people lived in the Middle Ages, what was their way of thinking, and how the attitudes of individuals influenced historical processes and events. The creation of simulation games will certainly contribute to this, which in turn would enable better historical thinking and understanding, which will ultimately result in an even better teaching of the Middle Ages. Due to the time, I will focus exclusively on informal learning in museums and archives. I would like to present an example from 2015, when the world was introduced to Pepper, a humanoid robot developed by the French company Aldebaran Robotics. 6 of these robots occupy 3 Washington-based museums of the Smithsonian to answer visitors' questions and tell stories using voice, gestures, and an interactive touchscreen. As the Smithsonian's page says, that visitors love to interact with Pepper, and according to the New York Times, the bots will even pose for selfies. The Smithsonian plans to introduce more Peppers to other museum locations in the future. I am sure that such and similar robots, which do not necessarily have to be humanoid, can also be placed at exhibitions related to the Middle Ages, near medieval sites, etc. This would certainly contribute to the education of the public on medieval topics, and even, I believe, to the demystification of some medieval issues. There are several advantages to using artificial intelligence in study of the Middle Ages. First, adaptable access stands out. Almost everyone who teaches the Middle Ages and those who study it would be able to access significantly more historical sources, and with the use of artificial intelligence, there would be a greater understanding. One of the advantages is certainly personalized learning. Artificial intelligence can adapt to the learner from content to assistance in terms of reading historical sources. Of course, the learner should be guided by a mentor and use literature related to the topic, because as we could see from the examples, individual programs can also make mistakes, so human help is necessary. Also, artificial intelligence can contribute to the detection of plagiarism. Among the disadvantages, the reduction of human interaction, which is essential for learning, especially at schools, stands out. Also, artificial intelligence is still quite expensive and inaccessible to everyone. Therefore, projects of analysis of medieval sources throughout artificial intelligence programs could require financial problems. Equally, artificial intelligence makes mistakes, which can lead to problems with the data and thus with the interpretation of the data. Here are some advantages and disadvantages related to learning the Middle Ages throughout artificial intelligence. As its application grows, I believe that the list will expand. To summarize, the use of artificial intelligence in the study of the Middle Ages is certainly a topic that will need to be discussed in future research. This paper cannot by any means provide final solutions, but only offer a possible way in which artificial intelligence could be used in the study of the Middle Ages. In addition to my hypothesis, and based on the examples from the presentation, it should be said that the use of different artificial intelligence programs can expand the availability of medieval sources to a larger number of students and thus to a better understanding of historical circumstances. Finally, by introducing artificial intelligence programs into informal learning, the Middle Ages and its correct interpretation will be able to be presented to the public. This is my literature I use when creating the paper, and thank you for your attention. I hope I managed the time.
Thank you. You also came in absolutely perfectly on time, so thank you. This is a very well-timed session. No pressure on the next speakers. Okay, the next speaker we have should be Zohrab. Give me, I'll switch my. Zohrab, do you have
It's me.
slides?
Yeah, I have slides, and I'll try to share it.
And while you're doing that, then I shall read your introduction.
Do you see the slides?
We do. We're in the same position where we can't see the show just yet, but yes, that's working. Great.
Okay.
So Zohrab
Try to
Gevorgyan.
change the page if you want to try also to check. Is it changing the pages?
That changed? Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity, dear colleagues. Today I'll talk about the use of miniatures of medieval ages, particularly miniaturists of Cilician Armenia. Mostly it is about Sarkis Pițac and Toros Roslin, who were miniaturists of 13th and 14th centuries. And during my experience, I worked both in scientific institutions and also I taught simultaneously in universities and schools. It helped me, it gave me a good platform to synthesize scientific approaches with teaching techniques. And it brought me to collaboration with my colleagues from University College of London, and in collaboration with our colleagues, history teaching specialists from Canada, from Great Britain, we prepared a book. First of all, I just want to talk about concepts, our philosophy, how we developed and how we used medieval miniatures and the different other sources for our teaching, to develop our teaching techniques and approaches. And we published a book in 2020, the Book of Teaching History, Why and How, which is widely used in Armenian schools and in universities. It's a very universal book. There are huge quantity of strategies and different approaches in history teaching, where I included also miniatures, how to use miniatures in teaching history, Middle Ages, and etc. So first of all, I just want to show you some miniatures, which I brought as an example to show very bright examples of Armenian miniature school of 13th and 14th centuries. And then I'll present some strategies which are based on these miniatures, which I used during my classroom, during my classes. This is a miniature of 13th century from the Gospel of Keran. Keran was the queen, wife of the king of Cilician Armenia, Levon or Leo. In 13th century, Leo was the king who also, in the times of Leo, Marco Polo also visited Cilician Armenia, and they are from the same period. And this is from this miniature. The author is or Toros Roslin or another painter. And the second miniature belongs to Sarkis Pițac. This miniature is named Trial in Armenian Datastan. it is Sarkis Pitsak just depicted the process of trial in Cilician Armenia, where there is king, there is also the judge and the people who are talking and discussing something. And this is from 14th century, King Levon. So based on these two miniatures, I just try to show some strategies or activities which can be used both in schools and more in universities, by the way. This is very simple strategy, which is about how students just analyze visual material. This is called instant view of the image. And the steps are just instructor just shows with a projector the miniature, and then after 5 or 10 seconds, the instructor just turn off the screen and then ask some questions, which helps students to visualize and to remember different details in the miniature. So just asking questions like this: what did you see in the image, or what did you remember from the image? And each student can mention 1 or 2 or more components, and then the instructor turns on the screen and asks what is happening in the image and what we can conclude about the given environment. And there is also a very simple question, for example, concerning this miniature of Sarkis Pitsak. I can bring some examples from my experience of teaching. When I ask students what is going on in this miniature, though the real process is shown in Armenian, which is just it is written here just behind the king, datastan, which means trial, but the students don't notice very obvious details in the image, and they just ask, and then after 15 minutes, they only after 15 minutes they notice that there is written datastan or trial, and they give different interpretations. So this kind of miniatures can serve to understand, to explore medieval history from different perspectives, from political perspective, from cultural perspective, from judicial perspective, even from gender perspective, because some students notice that there is woman depicted there. And when I ask, do they speak with each other? Because this is just like a pyramid, ruling pyramid of Cilician Armenia, where there is king, there is the hand of the god, you see there above all. It means that all the laws of that state is based on divine laws. And when I ask, do they speak with each other, which means they are discussing something, and there is no any dictate in this trial, because people who are symbolizing these 3 men are speaking with each other, and there is something that they want to discuss and then to understand the conclusion of the trial. And which is very interesting from the perspective of media literacy. I always combine such kind of miniatures with the real texts. For example, the codes of Mahitar Ghosh or Sambat Conetable, which are the authors of the codes of laws of Cilician Armenia, which was used by the state. And there are numerous clauses, judicial clauses, which are concerning different spheres of society. I can bring an example, which is about from the code of Mahitar Ghosh, which is about selling of bees, and there the author just describes how the bees were sold in Cilician Armenia, and there is law when the bees are sold, for example, in the autumn. and there is difference when bees are sold in the spring, and combining miniature with real text gives students more understanding about reality, about historical context, and then organizing a discussion helps students not only give interpretations based on visual material, but combining visual material with the real text, with the sources, gives more deep understanding about judicial environment of Cilician Armenia from different perspectives. Also helps very effective or role playing when it can be used in schools, in middle school or in high school, when teacher can organize a role playing, just like using these two material. For example, this is a trial process, and then there are different clauses in the codes, and teacher can give different students different roles, and they can discuss from different perspectives. For example, one students can have the role of peasants, another the role of judge, another the role of king, and it helps to understand history from different perspectives and to develop also in the classroom historical empathy, which is the main concepts of history teaching today. It's a very important concept, which is about to understand historical context from the different perspectives, and to develop multi-perspectiveness in history teaching. Also, there are different clauses from the mentioned codes of Mahitar Ghosh and Sambat Sparapet or Constable. These two codes, I just want to repeat, were the codes which were used by the state, and these were the real laws which were used in society of Cilician Armenia, and these codes were the results of synthesizing of codes of different states, Byzantine law or Western law, and also the law heritage of Armenian reality. And for example, this point is concerns to the relations of husband and wife, and here is written that this refers to a woman which want to divorce from husband because of hatred, and this kind of text also helps to understand the reality when there were different relations between spouses, and how they were divorcing and how they were separating their wealth, how were protected women's position and rights even, and there are numerous such clauses included in the codes of Sambat Constable and Mahitar Ghosh, and it helps also to understand the same judicial environment of Cilician Armenia from gender perspective, from also economical perspective, and it helps also to develop again the same multi-perspectiveness of history, and the use of miniatures helps to understand how very important the trial processes in Cilician Armenia that Sarkis Pitsak just depicted, the only miniature showing the king Levon in the trial process, and it helps also to boost the understanding about historical significance, which is another concept in history teaching. Among different other techniques and strategies, I also want to separate one simple but very, I think, important approach, which is about comparing different times, where I used the crucifixions of Jesus of Sarkis Pitzak of 14th century, and then there is also another painter of 20th century, Minas Avetisian, who was impressed by Sarkis Pitzak's works of crucifixion, because there are numerous crucifixions of Sarkis Pitzak, and sometimes I just organize an activity which is about comparison of different times from the perspective of mentality, from the perspective of worldview, and from the perspective of change and continuity. And just I show students, and we try to compare these two crucifixions from different perspectives. It helps to understand, really helps to understand, and to also to feel historical empathy, to understand the times, different times, why Sarkis Pitzak depicted Jesus in this way, why Minas Avetisian in being impressed by Sarkis Pitzak, but he depicted himself on the cross. It's very interesting activity, and it helps. Every such activity in different classrooms gives different effect, and it helps students to understand multi-perspectivity and change and continuity, even comparing 14th century with 20th century. And at the end, I just want to bring another example of comparison of different miniatures. These miniatures are not about Cilician Armenia, but this is about Armenian reality of Great Armenia. And I just want to show some miniatures which are showing class process, a lesson. This is from a lesson miniature from Glazor University of 13th and 14th century. This is from the school, just class process, lesson process from monastery of Tsipna of Grigor Chalatetsi from 15th century, and another from University of Datev, which is from 15th century. This is also just a miniature which is showing a class process where the teacher is very big, Grigor Datevatsi, and another from about 7 liberal arts of Herada von Landsberg. Why I just want try to show these miniatures, because these kind of miniatures can serve to compare different times from the perspective of education. And sometimes when we organize a discussion, what is going on in this process, and what do you see, what kind of details you can separate, and asking different other questions and organizing discussions gives a real understanding of different times from the perspective of education, from the perspective of school, how they were organizing the school process, how the political establishment influenced on education. Just like I just wanted to bring the example of very obvious example of Grigor Datevatsi of 15th century, where there was no Armenian statehood in that time, and you see there that all Armenians are depicted just like Mongoloids, because that was the time of invasions, Mongol and Turkmen invasions in Armenia, and they were just forced to depict themselves just like Mongoloids to keep their heritage, cultural heritage, to be protected, and from this this miniature, it is very obvious how was the reality and how was the political situation influenced the school. And you see here different concept of organizing of school, where there are shown different books. This is the time of parchment, the real kingdom of parchment, saying symbolically. And then you see here of 15th century when gradually was the transformation process from parchment to paper, and you see here a different school, a different lesson and the different positions of students and teacher. And then this Grigor Tatev is University of Tatev of 15th century, which is the time when sometimes we say Dark Ages, the beginning of Dark Ages, when in Armenian reality, in Great Armenia, were started different invasions, and until 19th century, almost 19th century, there was a decline, and Tatev Hamalsan is very symbolical, maybe the start of the start of Dark Ages. So just different questions which helps to understand and which can help the teachers to organize discussions. For example, how did medieval school and school processes change during the time, and students can understand how was influential influential was the role of church in medieval school, and they can even compare of their today's school with the schools of medieval times. There is very interesting process how they are understanding, because sometimes they don't understand the reality of historical different historical times, just like medieval times, and they don't understand that the role of church was very influential in that time. And these kind of questions and miniatures help to visualize the reality, help to understand the history from the perspective of historical empathy, and also to compare with different trends which were coming to Armenian educational environment from liberal arts, because in Armenian schools they were also called liberal subjects were also called liberal arts, just like in different universities of Europe. So this is my main content which I wanted to share with you. There are different also things which I would like to share also from my experience, but I'll try to limit it in these two components, miniatures and different texts, which also helps to go further and to develop historical strategies and history teaching and approaches. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zohrab. So another fascinating paper, and the three papers are tying wonderfully well together. And it looks like we have one that will also fit very neatly into this theme as well. So our last speaker today is Heather Blatt, who is a associate professor of English at Florida International University. Heather, do you have a PowerPoint that, oh, I think, Zohrab, you need to stop sharing, don't you?
Yes, once, perfect, great.
Fantastic.
So let's see. All right, so on the first day of class, I sometimes circulate a survey among my students. One of its questions is, what comes to mind when you think of the Middle Ages? I don't include that question all the time because the answers usually depress me. I get comments like Shakespeare and fights in pubs, or Jane Austen and knights and ladies. I'm sure many, if not all of you, have encountered stereotypes, misconceptions, and other biases among your own students. As Zohrab noted just a few minutes ago, the reality of historical times and historical empathy can be challenges for students to reach. In fact, several years ago, I came across this bingo graphic that identifies many more such preconceptions and stereotypes. The preconceptions and stereotypes that students thus bring to the study of the Middle Ages and of medievalism can be numerous. On one hand, prior knowledge that they bring can be encouraging because it speaks to how medievalism pervades popular culture. On the other hand, preconceptions can complicate critical analysis of both the Middle Ages and medievalism. After thinking about this challenge for several years, and as I said, becoming depressed by the survey answers, I developed an assignment I now use at the start of classes, both face-to-face and online, in lieu of the survey. My focus today will be to introduce the assignment to you, then contextualize it within the scholarship of teaching and learning, and my own experience using it, in the hope that this assignment might offer a useful template for your own class use. I call this assignment the cognitive bias assignment, and or the confirmation bias assignment. I sometimes waver on the terms, and I typically use 3 variations of it over the course of a 16-week semester. It invites students to question their biases through a 3-step process that promotes critical reflexivity, with which Kenneth Gergen defines as an, quote, attempt to place one's premises into question, to listen to alternate framings of reality. As a result of this reflexivity, students can approach subsequent readings in my classes with a more open mind and greater curiosity to learn about medievalism and the Middle Ages that differ from their expectations, which can also facilitate student interest in the global Middle Ages or global medievalism. Before I dive into the assignment, however, I also want to contextualize it. I teach at Florida International University, also known as FIU. With over 50,000 students, it's the 8th largest university in the United States. The majority of our students are minorities, 11% are Black, 68% are Latinx, making it the country's largest Hispanic serving institution. The majority of our Latinx students have come within 1 to 3 generations from Cuba, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, and elsewhere in Latin America. In addition, 48% of undergraduates at FIU receive Pell Grants, which is used as an index of financial need. Of universities receiving Pell Grants, FIU is within the top 20. These statistics point to a complex and nuanced teaching situation where the majority of my undergraduate students carry a high number of work hours each week, as the income is a necessity, even while they try to pursue full-time undergraduate studies. And the majority of my students are from populations that may see medieval studies, especially with its focus on Western Europe, as distant from their own cultural heritage. Thus, some of my work in teaching involves engaging students' interest in studying the Middle Ages and medievalism from a starting point where Western, primarily American popular culture may be the major influence shaping their perceptions of medievalism and their biases about the Middle Ages. I also teach within a context where the university encourages students to complete their education in the typical 4 years, a directive that the university is pushed to promote under threat of loss of state funding from Florida, but which also runs counter to how previous generations of students at FIU have balanced their financial needs with a slower pace towards a degree. These are points that have an impact on how students approach their study and are ones to which I'll return as I discuss the impact this assignment has had in my classroom. So, to begin with, what is cognitive bias or what is confirmation bias, and how does it work as an assignment on medievalism? Cognitive bias is one of many strategies that people use to make sense of the world. These strategies are useful because we struggle with too much information, but too little meaning, with the need to act fast, but uncertainty about what to remember. This combination of circumstances often leads us to rely on assumptions, to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, and to project our assumptions onto the past and even the future. These reactions all complicate studying the Middle Ages and medievalism. Here's how my assignment tackles these issues in 3 steps. Step 1, I ask students to spend 10 to 15 minutes free writing what they already know about a topic like the Middle Ages. I give what Jessica Fernandez calls what comes to your mind prompts to get them thinking about the period, using figures and topics most likely to be recognized by my students. So King Arthur, Knights, the Crusades, Beowulf, feudalism. I ask a couple of questions such as, are there TV shows or films that you associate with the period like Game of Thrones? And I ask about expectations. For example, would you expect women of this period to be strong or mostly reliant upon men? Do you think medieval people thought about the ethics of eating animals or cared about sanitation? And let me note that at the end of my discussion, I'll share 3 iterations of this assignment with you in case you'd like more details than the kind of thumbnail sketch I'll be giving here today. Step 2, I provide 6 to 10 resources and ask students to spend about an hour reading their choices among these options, and to take notes as they read about what information is new or surprising to them. And then step 3, I ask them to write a reflection where they consider their experience researching a subject that they thought they knew about. I ask them, what was it like? Did your interpretations of the Middle Ages change at all over the time you spent on this activity? And if so, how? And how might you approach your readings in this class differently as a result of this process? Upon completing these steps, students submit their free write, their research notes, and their reflections to me. As I mentioned, I reiterate this assignment multiple times over the course of a class, repeating it at the start of new units and changing the topics from the Middle Ages to issues like medieval gender, race in the Middle Ages, or to places and cultures that I'm teaching texts from, such as medieval Africa or Ming Dynasty China. Even in a class on medievalism, I often keep the confirmation bias assignments focused on the historical Middle Ages in order to give the students some grounding that casts into relief the choices made in creating works of medievalism. And as I'm sure you know, it's hard to see those choices being made in works of medievalism if those works are also your primary sources for understanding the historical period. So why these choices? Why this sequence? Here's where I'll unpack the design of the assignment and contextualize it within the scholarship of teaching and learning. The assignment begins with a description of why this assignment exists, which I explain as a way to prepare students to read critically by considering what experiences, assumptions, knowledge, and perspectives we bring to a text. I then define confirmation bias, give some examples, articulate the goals of the assignment, and provide a breakdown of how much time students should expect to spend on the subsequent steps of the assignment. Even calling the assignment a confirmation bias assignment is a choice I made that can motivate students for whom bias is often a nasty 4-letter word that they don't want to be used to describe themselves. The first active step after these instructions begins with, as I've noted, the free write in response to the what comes to your mind prompts. These prompts begin the process of critical reflexivity by inviting introspection into what students already know and believe. Including this step enables students who have already taken classes in medieval studies to remind themselves of what they've learned. And it also invites students for whom my class may be their first engagement with medieval studies since high school, or first ever, to assess what they already know and believe. This flexibility in design makes it possible to meet students where they are, which is a tenet of learner-centered teaching. The goal of learner-centered teaching, as Terry Doyle explains, is to, quote, create learning environments that optimize students' opportunities to pay attention and actively engage in authentic, meaningful, and useful learning. I'll return to this point shortly, but I touch on it now because the free write establishes the groundwork for this assignment to enable authentic, meaningful, and useful learning. Because the change of mind most students experience over the course of the assignment means that the assignment very quickly begins to matter to them and motivate them to learn more. Furthermore, by acknowledging and bringing into class what students already know, the free write is rooted in rejection of what Paulo Freire critiques as the empty vessel model of pedagogy. As Freire writes, quote, one does not liberate someone by alienating them. Authentic liberation, the process of humanization, is not another deposit to be made in a person. We can, he continues, accept neither the mechanistic concept of consciousness as an empty vessel to be filled, nor the use of banking methods of domination, where students are expected to receive, file, and store deposits of knowledge. That is, this assignment helps students produce their own knowledge by comparing what they knew at the start of the assignment to what they choose to learn among the resources I provide them and how that impacts how they think about the topic of the assignment. So moving on to the resources and the research step, because confirmation bias involves focusing on what you already agree with, rather than enabling students to conduct their own research for this first critical assignment, I provide some resources for them. This first iteration of the assignment relies primarily on readings that are aimed at mainstream audiences and found on the internet. One of the resources I routinely provide is titled How the Middle Ages Really Were, and it is a listicle that critiques and responds to 6 myths about the period. I also include a blog post that goes into detail to explain that the Middle Ages were pretty interesting, actually. And other resources include an excerpt from an environmental history timeline, a brief news article from the website of a British nonprofit cultural organization that discusses Muslim Viking interactions, an image-rich page about the roles of medieval women in Christian Western Europe aimed at high school students, and a few others. As I noted initially, the majority of students I teach often bring more stereotypes to my classes than they do well-grounded historical understanding. Consequently, the trajectory many undergo in completing this assignment involves realizing that they know very little about the Middle Ages. I'll delve into that response more shortly, but it contributes to a key point underlying why I've relied on informal resources aimed at general audiences. That is, I want students to realize that they're not alone in knowing little about the historical Middle Ages, that they aren't the first people to have thought however it is that they think. The goal of this assignment, in other words, is not to shame students for not knowing more, but to motivate their curiosity and reward their research efforts. Providing resources aimed at general audiences conveys these points subtly, but in a way that I hope leaves students not feeling critical about themselves as individuals, which might lead them to close down, but instead to engage in authentic learning. I do not expect students to read all of these resources. As I said, I provide 6 to 10 routinely. Indeed, rather than requiring that, I set a time limit, 1 hour, which includes both reading and taking notes, and I provide more resources that can be read in an hour. This creates space for students to make their own choices about what they read. While incorporating agency through deciding what to read may seem a minor point, it's actually accomplishing more pedagogical work than may seem evident at first glance. First, crafting opportunities for students to make decisions about what they're reading and learning helps build intrinsic motivation. We've all encountered students who are reluctant to do the assigned reading. Rather than contributing to that experience by restricting what students read regardless of what might interest them, the resources I just described address a range of topics and include varied writing styles and lengths. Even if a student undershoots an hour, they'll be reading at least 1 item. The majority of my students read 2 to 4 items, and a few say that they get so interested in the process that they read everything. According to their reflections, they find themselves eager to read more as the first choice of reading begins to challenge what they thought that they already knew. So when students become engaged in this way, when they start feeling stimulated or curious or surprised, they create what Susan Ambrose and others in their volume, How Learning Works, refers to as an affective goal. Thus, the assignment starts to satisfy more than one goal. It satisfies mine, and it starts to satisfy goals students begin developing about on their own about what they want to learn, motivating then the pursuit of the activity and their success in completing it. This confluence of goals adds to the value of the assignment, where students gain satisfaction, quote, simply from doing the task rather than from a particular outcome of the task. That is, for many students, the assignment can produce intrinsic value. I'm not telling students they have to think a particular way. I'm just providing a bunch of evidence, and I'm letting them draw their own conclusions based on what they choose to read among the evidence that I've initially supplied. When students submit their work, they include their research notes. This provides some accountability in documenting what they read, and it also lets me get a sense for not only what they read, but how they understood it and how they study. My classes are typically ungraded classes, which means that I'm not providing quantitative grades on the assignments. I'm not giving points or letter grades. I'm giving quite detailed qualitative feedback. So when providing feedback on this assignment, I can comment on any step along the way from what the students have submitted. I can comment on the quality of the note taking and provide tips if I think that they're necessary or helpful. Including the research notes when students submit also allows me some insight into what can go wrong. For example, I once had a student complete the assignment by declaring that the Middle Ages were as dirty and brutish as she thought all along. It was a great example of confirmation bias at work. And as I reviewed her notes, I realized what had happened. She had read only one of the linked readings, the listicle that itemized several myths about the Middle Ages. She had not only skimmed the article, but she had only read the myths, not the debunking that followed each myth. I reached out to her via feedback, and we had a great conversation where she realized that completing work as quickly as possible, which again, at the start of my discussion, I mentioned it corresponds to some of the institutional pressures at work at FIU. She realized that completing work as quickly as possible could cause problems for her. And the next several assignments saw her improving as a critical reader as she slowed herself down and engaged more fully with the details of our work, making a subsequent assignment on slow reading one of her most transformative assignments of the class. Finally, the last key step of the assignment before submission involves a reflection. It can be a challenge for some students, as the temptation to summarize their notes is great. But for those who attended the guiding questions, they complete a reflection that involves metacognitive self-evaluation. That is, they're paying attention not simply to what they learned, but to how they learned it. This frequently leads them to tease out implications for their own thinking habits, and they often also introduce arguments about how societies, popular culture, and other influences have shaped their educational experiences prior to this moment. These moments of realization that students articulate are some of the highlights for me in reading what they submit, because students move not only towards becoming critical thinkers, but critical learners who begin to consider what they want to learn and who are also aware of different influences on their learning. I build upon these moments not only in subsequent confirmation bias assignments on different topics, but assignments that I've created that address, for example, slow reading as a tactic students can use to resist the way our present moment and the pressures on them at FIU to complete their education quickly. Encourage them to value speed as a measure of success, something that I don't necessarily agree with and that I frequently wish that they would just slow down. So I've created an assignment that really encourages them to slow down and to reflect upon what slowness brings to their experience as critical readers and thinkers. Furthermore, the combination of the first free write step, where students discuss what they already know, and this final reflection step, where students discuss what they've learned, addresses inclusivity in the way that creating space for students to write about personal experiences and values relevant to the course can lessen social identity threats and create a sense of belonging. Activities like this assignment can thus help reduce achievement gaps related to gender, to geography, and to social identity. As with the close reading assignment, I build on this aspect of confirmation bias, the confirmation bias design in multiple ways. My courses revisit and further practice self-reflection by incorporating multiple self-assessment assignments where students consider what they've learned, assign themselves grades with which I agree or disagree and comment on why, and they justify their grades. And I revisit the idea of belonging and social identity in close reading assignments like ones where I introduce them to the concept of resistant reading and invite them to free write about who they are and what perspective they bring to the texts as readers. While I create a path for students to explore how their identity interacts with their reading without revealing personal details to me, students often willingly disclose details as they explore what it means to read like the person they are in the fullness of their identity. So for example, I might have a student who identifies as a Cuban exile and is gay, think about what it means to write what it means to read a text that centers a female point of view, or what a woman who comes to a text realizes what it means to, throughout her life, have read texts written to kind of center a male perspective. This can be invaluable to classes that center literature that strike students as very distant from themselves, whether that distance involves race, culture, time, or other aspects that can lead students to struggle to find space for themselves in a class. In closing, let me note that I don't wish to overstate my claims about what this assignment achieves. It will not, in isolation, produce Freire's authentic liberation. It's also possible to use this assignment in a class that otherwise contradicts or complicates the values and practices embedded in this assignment. And this assignment is not by any means set in stone. As I've come to recently learn more about critical reflexivity, I realize that I can improve the design of the assignment in the future to nudge students from simply recognizing biases to thinking more explicitly about the impact of their assumptions, perspectives, and actions. And of course, this is all in some ways in the long term geared towards producing action involved through engagement in the class, but also action involved in thinking about how the class and what they learn in my class can translate to their lives outside the classroom. Yet nevertheless, I do argue that this assignment can model values and practices that a class can magnify in ways that can profoundly affect students, how they learn in and around their biases, and how they reflect on the world outside the classroom. The students respond to these assignments with frankness, thoughtful introspection, cultural analysis, generosity, authentic learning, and pleasure. Indeed, many cite the confirmation bias assignments as their favorites of the class. As a last note, I'm going to place in the chat a link to the 3 variations on this confirmation bias assignment and the bibliography that accompanies this presentation, should you be interested in reading more about some of the foundational influences that have led me to design this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather, for yet another fascinating talk. And for me, certainly from my perspective, the way that those 4 papers spoke to each other was really very interesting. So I suspect we have some time for some discussions, and I suspect we have a good chat ahead of us, given how many of us are involved in one way or another in the teaching of students about a subject that we are, after all, enormously passionate about. I will suggest, so the process that I've just seen your link there, Heather, into the chat. The process we normally adopt is if you want to put something in the chat, we can read out the question, or preferably if you want to raise your hand, and then Juan, ideally, who is the technological guru here, will be able to unmute and you can ask the questions directly. I would like to invite, since the papers did actually speak to each other, I would like to invite any of the speakers first if they have any questions that they wanted to ask any of the other speakers. Certainly in terms of the overlap, if anyone has any ready. Failing that, I have some questions. But Heather, you've spared the panel from my ramblings.
I have a question for Shivender. If you don't mind, when you approach the teaching of the Middle Ages, as you described in your presentation, how do you find students usually react? Are they very receptive? Are they uneasy? Does it? I'm just really curious to know how they perceive your approach.
Well, as I said in my presentation as well, they are too biased. They are too biased about everything, the way it has been projected in the short films and the way discussions have happened. And of course, the history that they have read. A lot of political things are also happening in our country. So I won't comment much on that. However, I would say that their perception is very limited, I would say, and biased, too biased. They are too prejudiced.
Do they change their mind over the course of your class? How do they feel?
Of course.
Yeah, awesome.
So I teach law students, so I don't teach this particular topic to them. However, while teaching them, I try to incorporate these things to make them more humanistic. And since we teach human rights, then we also talk about this racial discrimination, caste-based discrimination, caste, creed, religion, and all those things. So we try to relate it with them.
I wonder if I could pick up on that question of bias as well, because I was very interested, Heather, in you saying about bias and how, and certainly that's been my experience of my own students who talk about how this text, they say very often to me with a very straight face, this text might be biased. You know, it's all biased. You know, there's no possibility of avoiding it. And I was very interested in some of the exercises that all 4 of you put forward of ways of confronting and forcibly confronting that bias. You know, particularly I loved Zohrab, I loved your visual material analysis, putting something up and asking people to say what they've seen, that kind of Gestalt approach that I think forces us to focus our attention on the context, which again, the chat GPT experiment with Petra talks about, you know, think about how AI might sort of explore the context and where it evaluates its own sources. And I'm thinking about one of the asides that, again, Heather, you said about meeting students where they are as a process of good pedagogy, and thinking about that critical reflection on the process of learning. Do you find a continuous process throughout your classes? Is it something that you sort of do at the beginning and that then changes the pedagogy? And is it a process that you adopt yourselves in evaluating your own capacity to teach as teachers?
It is indeed a continuous process, as I told earlier as well. And of course, I talked about 3 Ds, discussion, deliberation, debate. So this is how we learn. Of course, I may not be knowing all perspectives. However, if I include 60 odd students in my discussion, they would be in a position to tell us more about it. And since it's a digital age, information is widely available. So I personally believe while teaching them, we will have to use these 3 Ds, discussion, deliberation, and debate. And of course, that will lead to a discourse. And using these 3D techniques, I think a lot of myth and I would say biases will get over.
I found myself incorporating brief reflections after more and more assignments. So the confirmation bias assignment, which concludes in the reflection, is something that occurs 3 times over the course of the class. Then there are dedicated self-reflection assignments where I expect them to spend an hour or more writing about what they've achieved, how they perceive their learning and their accomplishments in the class since the previous self-assessment assignment. And then other assignments, including discussion assignments, I asked them to submit reflective takeaways based on the discussion. What are they leaving with, and what are they holding on to as they leave the discussion? So that over the course of the class, what I'm hoping to encourage is an ongoing process of reflection, particularly where students can get to the point, if they're not there at the beginning of the class, by the end of the class, they can get to the point where they can recognize or catch themselves in a moment of building on an assumption and catch it in time to question themselves, maybe do some research, maybe remind themselves that they need to be open to changing their minds. And I reinforce that through feedback throughout the class. When I see that happening, I point that out to students. I'm like, hey, look, here's something I see that you did that was really significant and is intellectually challenging to do. So I want to highlight it for you so that you recognize that you did this and can keep it in mind for the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Zohrab, I saw that your hand was up earlier.
My question to Dr. Blatt, and it is about about grading, and sometimes it's very hard to grade. Not only formal grading, but also the giving feedback, because when we say understanding about history, it's very relative process, and sometimes it's very hard. And I think, what do you think? This process is very long term. To understand whether they have understood about even especially about historical empathy, because historical empathy is something which is hard to measure. It is hard to measure and to understand. Do they understood? Do they understand this one, that one thing? So my question is about how to formulate and to organize. I have two questions, actually. One is about project-based learning. Is it a good solution to make this process longer and to understand more measurable about students understanding whether they have understood or something, or they reached some outcomes, and etc. And another about feedbacks. There are different feedbacks, but after, for example, they have written an essay or something else, like you say, on what kind of criteria you mostly pay attention?
Yeah, so since I started practicing ungrading, and I put in the bibliography one of the ungrading resources that I has been most recently influential, but I'm also dropping a chat link, a link in the chat to Jesse Stommel's work, Introducing Ungrading, which was really helpful for me starting out. Part of what I have come to realize, the more that I grade and the more that I try to think about qualitative feedback as something that can build students up in the long term, I'm spending less time saying, hey, look, your essay was filled with grammatical errors. On one hand, I've also realized my students are not really being taught grammar. So in some ways, if they're not being taught grammar, it's not appropriate for me to grade them on grammar, because I'm introducing a set of expectations that had no prior foundation in their educational experience. So some things I've completely jettisoned that used to be very central to how I experienced grading as a student, and how I initially, because of that model, graded on my own. What I look for is, and this is where the reflections are really, really crucial, is students' awareness of their own development as learners. Are they recognizing achievements that they've made? And self-assessment is itself a learned skill, right? So I'm not necessarily expecting them to be good at it at the beginning, but I also look to see progress in self-assessment by the end of the class. So for example, with the first confirmation bias assignment, it's very typical for students to respond, as I mentioned, by summarizing their research notes. I learned this, and these factual details. And I'm like, well, I'm really glad you were able to highlight those. So I might say something like that to the student. But I also want you to go back and look at the questions I asked, because they don't actually ask you to summarize. Instead, they ask you to evaluate your thinking. And then I explained to my students what metacognitive assessment is. And I said, this is something you'll have opportunities to practice in subsequent assignments. So that's where kind of some of the returning nature of some of my assignments comes in useful. If they didn't get it on the first confirmation bias assignment, there's going to be a second confirmation bias assignment, though the topic will differ. I also try to emphasize connections to how these skills can play in the world outside the classroom. Not only do I say, practice this skill in your other classes and see how it works, or make connections to things you're learning in your other classes, but I might also say, especially where we're getting to the issue of cultural empathy, this can be really valuable to you in your life outside the academy. As you graduate, anytime you encounter a person or a different cultural context. So what you're practicing in my class here, I want you to keep in mind as something you can continue to practice for the rest of your life. And that I use as part of the feedback. So I'll comment on, hey, I see you doing this kind of empathy really effectively, or you caught yourself, and it's really clear to me, you caught yourself, you did some research, and that research you did about what your initial assumption is really showing up here in the quality of the analysis that you provided in the assignment. So I highlight that to you, student, so that you can continue to practice that in the future, so that you see that it's happening. So I'll do things like that, that sometimes mean I'm often not saying a lot about the specific content matter of the assignment. I'm not saying, you know, hey, look, you have said 3 correct things about the Middle Ages. But I'm trying to focus on habits of thought and critical thinking patterns that can translate to my students, who the majority of whom are never going to become medievalists. And so I'm trying to think about what's the value of what I can teach them for everything else that they might be interested in outside of that.
Once again, I noticed that creeping into the discussion is the term historical empathy, and I know that you can't say those words without Juan Manuel jumping out of his chair. Is that, I'm going to give the floor to you, Juan, your hand is up here.
Yeah, but my question is not about historical.
Okay.
Actually, my question is for Petra, but of course I would like to hear the opinion of the rest of the panel. I was very much, the experiment that you did with ChatGPT really caught my attention, right? Like the fact that this AI that is becoming so popular right now and so advertised actually gets the information, actually either misrepresents it or actually gets it wrong. And it reminds me of a conversation that I had last week with one of the other organizers of the conference and a professor. And at the time we were discussing the concern from an academic perspective of the use of AI, mostly in this case about the stifling of probably academic imagination. If we end up relying too much on AI, which is a programmed thing, it might actually end up putting boundaries on the type of research that we end up doing outside of what the AI is actually programmed to do. And I was wondering to some extent, what would be the implications of this toward the actual element of teaching? We have mentioned here a lot in the panel the problem of misconceptions, prejudices, and I mean, what I would like you to know your opinion about is, if ChatGPT and AI is in the beginning getting this information wrong, to what extent do you think it can pedagogically end up just reproducing the very same stereotypes that we are trying to actually fight against, mostly in a scenario in which, at least from my perspective, I think that it's going to become too convenient of a tool for academics and institutions not to use it. So I wonder what would be like your opinion, again, not only Petra's, but also the rest of the panels, because I think this is something that we as educators will have to deal in the future, how this AI is going to end up affecting not only the way of what we teach, but the very content of what we teach, and how to fight the prejudices, misconceptions, etc., that we have mentioned here.
Okay, thank you for your question. So I will try to answer it. So the main idea was that we cannot avoid using the artificial intelligence, because I saw the article that Italy banned ChatGPT use. So I was like, what are they going to achieve with that? Because the students will surely going to that site and they will search answers, etc. So I was like, how we can use ChatGPT without that ChatGPT uses us. So the main idea is that we need to develop synthesis between the using artificial intelligence and known sources such as secondary literature, primary sources, etc. So the synthesis between that is that the new generations are coming. Okay, maybe our generation is not familiar, and it will be a process to adapting the artificial intelligence, but the new generation, so not just historians or medievalists, but also the students who are listening some medieval subjects will surely use that. So we need to develop a way of using that to contribute to us, not to, I don't know, use it for plagiarism, for writing assignments, etc., but to learn students how to use it properly. So that was my idea, that we, of course, the research on that should be more conducted among the following years. But that was something that was concerning me, because we cannot stop using the artificial intelligence for students, but we can learn them how to use it.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Yeah, on my end, yeah.
Thank you. I wonder if I can again jump in and follow up on that question about AI, because one of the things that we noticed, and obviously it's been a lot in the news about particularly the artistic illustrations and how AI is doing art and artistic innovation, and some of the, I guess there's a sense of schadenfreude in the Twitter comments when people say, look, it's rubbish, it hasn't understood this or it hasn't understood that, and which completely misunderstands, or my understanding of AI is that we're actually very early on in the process of AI. And the point, like anything intelligent, is it's not about it being perfect now, but it is on its journey to be better and is permanently learning, like any good student should be. And so, the mistakes that you flagged up, I thought were very interesting, because very clearly by making those mistakes, it will be learning in itself to avoid those mistakes in the future. And we are participatory elements in that process. The thing that does sort of terrify me a little bit in the Terminator Skynet kind of scenario is how quickly and how exponential that process can be. If it can be more than one exponential, that process is exponential, terrifies me. However, one point about my eternal optimism, when I see the AI or the ChatGPT in particular asking questions about history, that seems to me quite good history, about the process of asking questions, about trying to understand a problem by continually challenging it, by asking it from different perspectives. It doesn't seem to me tremendously different from some of the other kind of pedagogical experiments that we're seeing in classrooms in this panel. Is there an element that AI is learning to be a better historian, do you think, from what you've experienced?
Well, when it comes to ChatGPT, is only about questions and answers. But when it comes to other projects, as I showed, the artificial intelligence can be and could become a better historian and medievalist, because one of the main ideas is that he can read texts, translate them into any language. I see the comment. I will thank you for the reference. So not only that some programs can become medievalists, but they can improve other researchers' research, etc. So maybe on that point.
I see that point that James and completely noted.
If I may add something, if I may add something. So what I personally believe is that this AI, or you talk about ChatGPT, it can be used as a subsidiary thing, and it can be used to make a framework or blueprint of your research. However, you cannot completely rely on the data that you get. They have already given this disclaimer that, and for instance, if we talk about medievalism, that is perfectly okay. But if you talk about any current affairs, it itself gives a disclaimer that the ChatGPT is trained up to September 2021. Anything that you ask beyond that, you won't be getting the results, that to correct results. So yes, what I personally believe is that you should drive the technology. You should not be driven by the technology. Like any good invention has been done in the past. For instance, if you talk about nuclear energy, you can use it to make missiles, you can use it to make electricity. So it depends upon the way you use the technology. You talk about dynamite, how to use it, you know it better. So I think handle with care, that is the only solution. And yes, we can incorporate ChatGPT just to get the framework. However, just to add the human emotions, just to double check the facts. And as Professor Blatt was talking about, the moment we try to find an information on the website, the first link that we see, and if it is in concurrence with what we are thinking, then we think that is the fact. But being a lifelong researcher, we will have to think beyond that. Any data that we get from ChatGPT or from any other AI websites, we will have to double check. However, if we are taking the help of AI, I'm not denying that taking the help of AI, we can use simulations with the help of AI. If we can get some simulations, that will be fruitful to teach them medieval ages. Interestingly, in India, a couple of days ago, there is one picture of Lord Rama is going through the internet, and they have made how Lord Rama, maybe thousands of years ago, that how he would be looking in the age of 21 years. The AI picture has made a lot of debate has sparked over that. However, they are doing this. So just for the sake of fun, or maybe just to create curiosity in the minds of the young budding lawyers or the students, that is good. But yes, we will have to double check and we will have to verify what we are getting from AI. This is what I personally believe. Handle with care.
If I can, just one comment on everything for conclusion for me. Yeah, I think the main mission of history and history teaching is to learn to compare different times. For what? To understand present time. And I think comparing of different times helps students to understand their time, to appreciate, to evaluate their time. This is very psychological, so some psychological component in this question. But overall, I think the big picture is about that, and why we compare different times from different perspectives, from technological perspective, from political perspective, and etc. Yeah. Really, the mission, the goal is to understand your time from different perspectives, the colors of your time, because the hardest thing is to understand our times. Really, itself. This is my comment to Juan, and thank you.
Thank you. That's too profound for me to follow up on. I don't dare to enter into that domain. We still have some time left. We have just under 5 minutes left. If anyone has any other questions they'd like to ask, either from the panel to each other. Juan.
Yeah, I mean, so if there's no question that I would like to ask two brief things. The first one is to Zohrab. I really enjoyed the miniatures that you showed us, and one of the topics that always come up with medievalism is, of course, the issue of prejudice and how we tend to imagine the medieval past. And I would like to ask you precisely about how is teaching the Middle Ages in a context like Armenia? What are like the ideas that are predominant about the Middle Ages, and how do you tackle these ideas? Because something that caught my attention is this miniature of the monks that you showed, that they are shown with Mongoloid features because it's in the moment of the Mongol invasion. Of course, one of the many issues that we discuss here is that often, at least in Europe and in the Western world, the Middle Ages are often imagined as completely white, which we can, of course, know it's not true. And visual images, visual, of course, images are visual, but images are a good source to try to counter this type of misconceptions. So in that, on that end, I would like to ask you, how is normally the teaching of the Middle Ages normally in history courses in high school and universities in Armenia? And second, how are the Middle Ages more broadly understood in a context like yours? And I'm also going to add another question, which is for Heather, which is, I really enjoyed the assignment, the confirmation bias assignment that you showed us. I already downloaded the instructions. I hope that I will eventually use it myself. But I wanted to ask you, of course, one of the issues with the Middle Ages is, as we have discussed in various panels, is that there is a political attachment of imagining the Middle Ages in a particular way, right? It's not only the misconception of, oh, I saw it in Game of Thrones, or, oh, I saw it in Braveheart. Sometimes it's a deep emotional and political element of perceiving the past in this particular way. And I was wondering if in your experience with this type of exercises, you had actually reactions from students from a political perspective of seeing the Middle Ages in this way, and if that has actually changed after doing the exercise. So maybe Zohrab could go first, and then Heather. Yeah.
Thank you for the question, and it's very hard question because we're living in the educational environment in Armenia. I can call it just symbolically, we are just in the transitional period when we are learning to understand history, not from the fatalistic point of view that everything which is written in the books, it's right or wrong or black and white. And the main thing that I just want to share with you is about to understand history from below. I can call it just like this, and not from the perspective of political establishment, but to understand history from the perspective of microhistory or everyday life history, how we visualize history, how we notice details. This is about some process which we are trying to do, because in Armenian schools, in Armenian universities, the main approach is about whether it's true or not. We have to break some stereotypes, how we perceive history, how we understand history from the perspective of communications, because sometimes we don't notice how the communications were changing during history. So this is about to understand history from details to the big picture. And what helps for this goal? The main thing is to give teachers tools, practical tools, examples of teaching activities, long-term or short-term activities, to understand history, historical context from multi-perspectiveness. So this is more a process of breaking stereotypes and then developing teaching techniques. And we try to do it through not only lesson books, which are adopted by Ministry of Education, but also we are trying to develop different strategies and techniques and to share our experience with teachers. This is a long-term process, but we try to do it because overall we live in post-Soviet era, and we have to break this vacuum and to understand history from different perspectives, not only from the perspective of a red color, but also, or one color, but also from multicolors of society. It's a long-term process, and we have to understand, and this is a psychological process, but we try to do something for this goal. Thank you.
On the political attachment to the Middle Ages, the primary political usage of the Middle Ages in the United States is in service to white supremacy. And so one of the things that I do right in the start of the second week of the semester, so in the first week of the semester, they do the confirmation bias assignment. Many of their heads explode. The Middle Ages is a lot more complicated and nuanced than I thought. And the second week of the assignment, the second week of the semester, I have them do an assignment that I call Why the Middle Ages Matter. And I give them a couple of readings, again, to choose among, so I'm not in a position to suggest that I'm writing a particular viewpoint myself, which I don't expect any of you to follow politics in Florida, but right now it's really fraught in higher ed. They're trying to outlaw our ability to talk about race in the classroom in the college and university context kind of all together, because it might hurt white people feelings mostly. So in this assignment, I give them some readings. Some of them include, articles on how the Middle Ages has been harnessed in service to white supremacy in the United States through Charlottesville, through other examples, through the emphasis on Anglo-Saxon identity, and so on and so forth. I do this partly to address and again motivate students' interest in the period. Hey, this is not completely studying the past for the sake of studying the past. People are using the past in particular ways in the present moment. But I also do it in ways that I hope forestall students self-disclosing their own political usage of the Middle Ages that might be affiliated with that, even if it's unknowingly so. Because one of the challenges is that in a very diverse classroom like the ones that I teach, I can have a student self-disclose something that incidentally reveals themselves to be racist. And then I have all the minority students who have to stay in the classroom with that student for the rest of the semester, knowing that that student incidentally or intentionally or quite purposefully thinks in that way that can affect my other students. So I do the Why the Middle Ages Matter assignment, both to kind of draw their attention to how the Middle Ages still has contemporary political currency in the United States, but also to potentially discourage them from building on their own investment in those affiliations in the space of the classroom, hopefully in a way that might change minds, but also hopefully in a way that means not all of my other students are going to be subject to those students disclosing what they believe in a way that could injure my other students. So that's kind of how I encounter the linkage between politics and the Middle Ages. I don't know if that's kind of how you're thinking about it or where you're coming from, but that's how I deal with it and try to deal with it.
Yeah, definitely. That's the angle, because I am very much interested in American politics. I am very much aware what DeSantis administration is doing in Florida. So yeah. that was my concern precisely.
Yeah, and politically, we're now, I mean, the legislation is complex and some of it is under legal injunction, but we're in positions where we have to be very careful about being perceived as espousing a particular political viewpoint. And so even in some ways, teaching the Middle Ages in a way that centers a global Middle Ages, that decenters medieval England, which of course was my specialization, is itself potentially running afoul of some of the political concerns. And so one of the things that I do in my classes these days is almost every assignment has multiple reading options. There are some reasons that I talked about that I include multiple reading options in the confirmation bias assignment, but other reasons for other readings. When I'm teaching medievalism, partly what I want is just their exploration of the way that medievalism can be linked to ideas about gender or be linked to ideas about race. And from my perspective, it doesn't really matter what they read as much as they have that realization. So I might give them 5 or 6 different options for what they read, and each student can be choosing something different because they're all going to come to that same exploration of the topic. But that also diffuses, not that I've been accused of it, or not that I expect to anytime soon, but that potentially also diffuses some of the political valences around teaching, how I'm teaching, where I'm trying to craft a very anti-racist approach to the Middle Ages by giving students options, as opposed to what is the current center of discourse is telling students they have to read this.
Right. Great. Thank you very much, Heather.
Sure.
Okay, well, this is an absolutely fascinating discussion that could go on, but I'm very conscious that we are over time at this point. So I'm going to draw the panel, I think, to a close. Tomorrow, I think, Juan, do you want to give us the details?
I can take so again. First of all, thank you to our panelists, and thank you, Andrew, again for agreeing to chair the panel this year. This is then the end of our second day. Tomorrow we will have our last two panels. So we will reconvene tomorrow in the morning at 9 a.m. Central European time for our panel, Digital Reconstructions of Medieval Spaces. Again, we hope to see you all there tomorrow, and you can use the same link. And thank you all our panelists and our audience. It has been a very interesting and exciting day, and I hope you have a nice evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for organizing this panel, and the conference more generally has been such a treat.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.